Development, BMZ. My name is Fatima Denton. I'm from the United Nations University, and I will be moderating the event today. I'd just like to start maybe to get a few of the housekeeping rules out of the way. Audio and video for active speakers is on a separate platform, and this will be streamed to the audience. The chat functions are active, and please use them so that we can you can actually engage with the speakers and the panelists. Let me just remind you also that this is a conversation that we're having today, and we hope that you will be sufficiently enthused, maybe even animated, so that we can keep these discussions rich. We want it to be interactive, and we want them to be dynamic. The event is live streamed on BMZ YouTube, and you can also tweet by using the hashtag #BerlingInsights. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing great turbulence as a result of the current coronavirus pandemic. These are uncertain times. We can even go as far as saying that these are unpredictable times. They are also difficult times. Now, all of this is unfolding while climate change, as you know, remains a 21st century challenge. We cannot wish it away. Is this an opportunity for humanity to challenge ourselves and to think optimally on how we can use natural resources more efficiently? Will our new direction of travel trigger a new urgency towards resilient economies, healthy ecosystems, and healthy lives? I think this is no secret to anyone that Africa is the continent that is least prepared for these upheavals. But it's also our greatest opportunity to demonstrate that climate change is development. Africa, in many respects, is our action hub. This is where we can exercise our preemptive strike. This is where also we can demonstrate that we can keep climate impacts at bay and foster development. My hope today in this conversation that we'll be having is that we can ask at least 3 questions. The first question is to basically ask ourselves, through the findings of the Agrica project, what is working? We've had 25 years of adaptation, strategies, and options. What is working? What can we scale up? Do we have enough information to act now? And what are these innovative solutions? And how do we start by de-risking financial instruments that could help affect adaptation options? The second question I hope we can ask, using the collective wisdom of our panel, is whether the science policy interface is working. Can science lead the way to policy, and can it help build resilience? And lastly, I'm also hoping through our audience, through our esteemed panelists, that we can also ask a question about how do we move to give adaptation a global push? Africa and the EU have had long years of cooperation. We are united by history and geography. Is it time to think about other forms of partnership? How do we scale up efforts to support evidence-based development cooperation and to climate-proof African-European cooperation? We are delighted to have a panel of worth, and to kick us off today in this conversation, and I insist on the word conversation, we are honored to have with us as our keynote speaker, State Secretary Martin Jaeger. State Secretary Jaeger has been in his current role since March 2018. He has held various public positions and was State Secretary in the Ministry of the Interior, Digitalization and Migration in the federal state of Baden-Württemberg. perfectly enunciated German accent, from 2016 to 2018. He was also head of the political staff and spokesperson to the Minister of Federal Ministry of Finance from 2014 to 2016, as well as the spokesperson for the Federal Chancellery between 1998 to 2005. He has served as German ambassador to the Czech Republic in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2004 and 2013 to 2014, respectively. He was also head of global external affairs and public policy at Daimler Mercedes-Benz between 2008 and 2013. Excellency, State Secretary, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Fatima, for your words of welcome and your kind introductory remarks. Your German is perfect, pronunciation, 100%. Yeah, I appreciate that. Dear Professor Rockstrom, dear Professor Gornat, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, I too would like to extend a warm welcome to all participants of the inaugural event of the Berlin Insights series on climate change and development, and of course also an especially warm welcome for our panelists and the audience. It's a pleasure and an honor having you with us today, all the more as this event is competing with the inauguration of a new American president that is currently on its way in Washington. And I suppose while we're discussing the new American president will be sworn in, and the fact that we have so many guests and participants in this event shows how well received this new series of annual events is. In this series, jointly hosted by PIK and the BMZ, or PIK and the BMZ, we seek to broaden the exchange between different actors from politics, science, and civil society. It's important that we share thoughts and analysis, and that we realign our positions. And I personally, I hope to learn a lot today. For today's sessions, we are focusing on promising approaches to accelerate climate adaptation action in African-European cooperation. Climate projections show an increase in both the intensity and number of extreme weather events. By 2030, more than 100 million people could be affected by extreme poverty due to climate change if no action is taken. And this being said, many countries have recognized the need to implement effective adaptation strategies in order to strengthen resilience. African countries in particular have launched important adaptation and resilience tools like the African Risk Capacity and the Africa Adaptation Initiative. However, there is often a lack of reliable information and solid data on the expected long-term impacts of climate change at the local, regional, and national levels. And to some degree, this data and knowledge gap can be closed by intensified cooperation between science and politics. This is why we're here today. Since 2018, PIK and the BMZ have been collaborating to further develop evidence-based decision-making through climate risk analysis under the Agrica project which Professor Gornat will expand on after my speech. But knowing about potential future climate risks is just the first step, and only a first step. We also have to make sure that all actors involved have the means and information they need to take action. It is therefore key to join forces and involve all types of actors, scientists, policymakers, practitioners, civil society, and the private sector. So it is my honor today to announce the official start of our deepened cooperation with PIK. PIK is one of the world's leading science centers in the field of climate research, and we are extremely proud of having them here with us in Germany. Our cooperation over the coming years is intended to help to address some of the key questions and challenges at the nexus of climate change and development. The first focus area of BMZ PIK cooperation is adaptation and resilience. As a regional focus, we have chosen the Sahel region, where we are proud to closely collaborate with Wascal as a strong and competent partner. Through this cooperation, we aim to provide a profound basis and additional knowledge for evidence-based interventions on the ground. And talking about evidence-based interventions, we would also like to see climate risk analysis as a standard climate proofing tool for international cooperation at the level of the European Union. During our Council presidency in the last 6 months, we established a good foundation, which we are hoping to expand starting with today's exchange. I would also like to emphasize the opportunity provided by the European Green Deal. This is a growth strategy for a carbon neutral and resilient future for Europe. But it also provides new opportunities for Europe's international cooperation. That's why the BMZ supports strengthening the external dimension of the European Green Deal. And this is also an opportunity for Africa-EU cooperation. I am looking forward to learning from today's discussion how we can bring these threads together. I look forward to the following presentation and to the panel discussion between our esteemed guests. I encourage you all, as Fatima pointed out at the beginning, to participate and post your questions to engage with the panel members. This important debate requires all of us to actively participate and exchange ideas and experience. Thank you all and enjoy what promises to be a lively discussion. Thank you. Fatima, I think your mic is muted.
Excellent. Have to unmute to be able to start talking. Thanks again, State Secretary, and thank you very much for emphasizing on the word exchange, which I think is important for co-learning, and that's what adaptation is all about. I think also your point about the EU Green Deal, and that being in itself a window of opportunity to foster greater collaboration with Africa is very much welcome. I omitted in my introduction to mention the importance of PIK and just how important they are in terms of the production of knowledge, but also in that sort of cooperation that you've mentioned between science and policy. Now, we are going to hear a presentation on the findings of Agrica which is an initiative that you'll hear a lot about from somebody who is well qualified to do so. This presentation will be given by Professor Dr. Christoph Gonert. Christoph is leader of the working group Adaptation in the Agricultural Systems at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. He holds a professorship at the Department of Agro Ecosystem Analysis and Modeling at the University of Kassel. He's also conducting interdisciplinary research, which is aiming to improve food security and resilience in tropical agricultural systems, and investigate climate impacts on agriculture and adaptation strategies, especially in how the agricultural sector can respond to changing climatic conditions in sub-Saharan Africa. Christoph studied agricultural economics and agricultural sciences at the university in Berlin, and before that he worked as a dairy farmer in northern Germany. So it'd be important to get Christoph's perspectives on the program that he's leading on. But we are also, as State Secretary mentioned in his introductory remarks, we're also very privileged to have a very esteemed panel. The panel is made up of the following individuals. We have Dr. Hassan Nyambe. Dr. Hassan Nyambe is from the African Union Commission. He holds the position of Environment, Climate Change, Water and Land Management within the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture, DREA. And he's working on climate change issues globally, as well as Africa-wide. Dr. Nyambe is also supporting the Great Green Wall, and we hope to hear some examples of what can be done through this initiative. The Great Green Wall for Africa, for Sahara and Sahel initiative, which aims to halt desertification in the region. He's also supporting the enhancement of the African water and sanitation agenda, and he's facilitating the implementation of the African regional strategy on disaster risk reduction. He's also worked on a very important framework, which is the Agenda 2063, and which is an agenda, it's the blueprint for Africa's development, and he supports the implementation of climate adaptation. He's also working on issues around warning systems and protecting against disasters. We're also very, very delighted to have Madam Carla Montesi. Carla Montesi is a director at the Director General for Development and Cooperation, DEVCO, and Directorate General for International Partnership, at the European Union since September 2018. She's responsible for the Directorate Planet and Prosperity, and also contributing to green growth as well as humanitarian security intervention in the Sahel. Madame Montesi has served as Director for Western and Africa within DEVCO, and this was from 2014 to 2018. Previously, she has held the position as Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. In her earlier career, Montesi also specialized in European affairs at the College of Europe in Bruges and worked in the fields of EU external policy for development and cooperation in Africa. She has extensive and high-level experience, I'm sure, which she would share with us today on matters related to EU activities within the continent of Africa. Very privileged also to have with us Professor Johann Rockstrom. Professor Rockstrom is the director of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Professor Rockstrom is also at the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at Potsdam University, and he's professor in water systems and global sustainability at Stockholm University. Previously, he had served as the executive director of the Stockholm Resilience Center and professor in environmental science. He has extensive professional experience in applied water research, planetary boundaries. I think it's safe to say that he birthed that very concept of planetary boundaries and resilience buildings in the global south. He's an internationally renowned scientist. He advises the European Union, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, and international organizations on topics related to climate change. Professor Rockstrom has been voted Sweden's most influential person on environmental issues and has been recently awarded the Albert II of Monaco Climate Change Award 2020. Our last speaker, but nonetheless not the least, Dr. Mumini Savadogo. Dr. Savadogo is the Executive Director of the West African Service Center on Climate Change and Adaptation Land Use, WASCO. I believe State Secretary made mention of the importance of WASCO in this initiative. Previous to his position with WASCO, Mr. Savadogo was also the first regional project manager for Benin, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And later he was head of Burkina Faso Office of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. He holds a PhD in agricultural and environmental sciences. He has also researched crop, livestock systems and sustainable land use, and has worked as a researcher at the University of Ouagadougou and at the National Institute of Environment and Agricultural Research. He has extensive practical and scientific experience of over 30 years. I almost said 40, sorry, of over 30 years in environmental topics and sustainable development on the African continent. So I think that we are very well positioned to hear from this very qualified and esteemed panel. But to kick us off on that, especially in terms of the findings of this initiative, I'd like to invite Professor Christoph Gornert to make his presentation. Christoph.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fatima, for this very kind introduction. So let me share my screen. I hope you can all see this right now. It's a great pleasure for me today to introduce the EPICA project, and I would love to give you some insights about evidence-based decision making or adaptation planning and why this is so. You can't see my screen. Now you can see it, I guess.
Yes, we can.
Sorry. And why this is so important for decision making, in particular when it comes to implementation of adaptation strategies. I think this is very important in the global south, and in particular in the Sahel zone, where we have a lot of evidence found in this project. And I think this is also very urgently needed because the most vulnerable people live in this area, and it's important to give them tools and support to help them to cope with the risks and the effects of climate change. So let me go through my presentation. And the first question we had in also with developing this kind of project was, how can we use climate risk assessments to guide adaptation planning? And how can we make use out of these results which have come from science? So to do this, we developed this project, and this is funded by the BMZ and also supported and co-designed by BMZ and also the GIZ. And the aim of the project is to have a more risk-informed and science-based adaptation planning to inform the NDC and the NAP investment processes in the global south, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa. To do this, we developed a participatory approach which informs and includes the key stakeholders from the beginning in this study or in this process to make sure that we have a suitable study approach, to make sure that we have a tailor-made policy advice which has in the end a high uptake of the study results. And the uptake is quite broad. Also, we try to address local smallholder farmers, but also we addressed high-level policy events and also worked a lot on capacity development, either via radio, but also on high-level policy discussions. The aim of this project focus on the impact component, where we already have a lot of evidence from the science, but it's also important to bring this evidence to the implementation. And of course, I think you're all familiar that climate change strongly affecting water resources, affecting crop production, food security, but also the economics and the vulnerability of the countries. But there we shouldn't stop. We should continue and ask the question, how could we use the impacts provided by science to bring this to action and to make sure that we have resilience in the adaptation planning, that we consider the costs and the benefits, and most importantly, also consider the people behind. So making sure that we have a high ownership of the adaptation strategy as well as in high stakeholder interest. And last but not least, also communicate the uncertainty, which always comes with scientific data. I would like to give you a very brief example of this chain I just introduced. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go in detail, but I also invite you to visit our web pages and look at our reports. But a very short snapshot on the climate impacts. I would start this on just one example. I think we worked in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa and mainly in the Sahel zone, but just one example for Ethiopia, which shows that the crop suitability, so the regions where you can grow certain crops, declines in most regions in the Sahel zone. Ethiopia, interestingly, has a quite diverse agroecological system. So we also find there regions where we have an increase in crop suitability and in other regions a decrease. The increase is marked here in green, the decrease in reddish color, and you can see this is really differentiates between region to region, and so we need really high resolution approaches to use the best for our adaptation planning. And we did this also with one selected adaptation measure for Ethiopia, where you can see on the left-hand side of this figure that there's in some areas an increase in suitability in crop production in general, but there are also many regions where you have a decrease, which is marked here in red. And in particular, the red areas, there you can see that the adaptation on the right side of this figure brings a very positive effect, that it reduces the effect, or it reduces the negative effect of climate change. And so this adaptation measure is a very useful measure, but agroforestry is not only useful in respect to the biophysical aspects of climate change, but also with respect to the costs and the benefits. And you can also see here a very positive return on investment of such a measure. Of course, in the beginning, you see some small drop with the investment costs, which you always have with some kind of investment, but then you have a very positive return on investment from this adaptation measure. And I think this becomes very clearly that here we really need regional adjusted assessments of adaptation measures. In the end, I think the costs and the benefits are not the only indicator which is helpful. As already mentioned, you should also focus on the institutional support. The stakeholder interest is quite important, but also aspects like if this measure could be upscaled, if we have certain co-developments or co-benefits which could be used, maladaptation and so on. And we developed some kind of metrics which ranks this for a set of adaptation measures, all in line with the NDC and NAP investment plans of the specific country, in this case for Ethiopia. I don't want to explain this metrics in detail, but what you can see is that it gives really easy accessible information for policymaker to use in which regard this measure is useful or also not so useful. I think this is quite important also to have these kind of metrics when you plan certain adaptation measures. And a few words on how to translate this to action in the end, the impacts we have just seen. I think we have developed a new platform which gives already for a lot of countries marked here in orange information on very brief information on so-called climate risk profiles for which support the NDC implementation across sectors where you can get access information for health, for agriculture, for water, energy, and so on. But you can also, there's a much more deeper look in each countries and also look at the specific adaptation measures. And this is then provided by the climate risk analysis. And today there are 12 more profiles launched on this website. And I also invite you to have a look there to see what is new there. A few words before I come to the close of my presentation. I think we have clearly seen that the uncertainty in climate change impact assessment could be reduced by science. I think this is the main message. And I think we have also seen that it is important to focus also on the climate impacts, and immediate action is needed to prevent substantial damages on the entire economy, not only the agriculture sector. And we have also seen, I guess, with the example of Ethiopia, that we really need context-specific adaptation planning, also together with the collaborations we have between science and policy, and also between German institutions and partner institutions in sub-Saharan Africa, mainly in the Sahel regions, as already mentioned, also with our very strong collaboration with Vascal. And we have also, I think it's clear that adaptation is in all cases more cost effective than coping with the risks of climate change. And finally, also scientific findings are key to support government and development actors, as well as farmers, to prioritize their adaptation investments, and by doing this, support the NDC and NAP processes, as well as in general development corporations. And with these words, I would like to thank you, and I hope to a fruitful discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christoph. I think that was a very insightful presentation. Thanks also for making the point about science and the importance of science in terms of reducing uncertainties, especially in terms of adaptation. I think it's also great that you emphasize the necessity for a whole of economy approach rather than just focus on agriculture. Some of the anticipatory approaches that you mentioned that are important, I think is something that will also guide our conversation today, as well as the importance of high ownership, the stakeholder interest that we need to enable action, but also the participatory process that you initiated in the course of this program. So I think you've set the scene very well, Professor Garnot. I'd like to now turn the conversation to Dr. Nyambe. Dr. Nyambe, you've had the State Secretary talk about this difficulty that we have in Africa in terms of the reliability of data. And I think by extension also, if we talk about reliability, we could also talk about the credibility of data. There is a sense that we do need this data if we are to anticipate some of the risks that are posed by adaptation. The African Union in itself as a body is doing quite a lot. And it's safe to say that the CAHOS, which is the Committee of African Heads of State and Governments on climate change, is also doing quite a lot. Could you give us a sense, Dr. Nyambe, about the importance of research, especially in terms of how we might be able to use research as a frontier to enable climate change adaptation? Dr. Nyambe, just very quickly before you start, I'd like to mention that there are several WebEx rooms just for our participants to know, and to know that the questions that they raise will be also raised, I'd say, by myself in this conversation. So please don't be shy to raise your questions. There are several WebEx rooms that are streaming some of these. Dr. Nyambe?
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for inviting us to this webinar. And maybe I'll start by making a small correction. Actually, we are no longer called Department of Rural Economy. We are now a Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Blue Economy, and Sustainable Environment. Basically, they did that to be able to give some prominence to issues of environment. And coming to the question that you have actually raised, we concur with the speakers who spoke before me in terms of the importance of data when it comes to decision making, for example, those that relate to climate change. We actually trying to put measures in place to be able to address some of those gaps. For example, we have got a new program now which is funded by the EU called Global Framework for Climate Services. And that actually aims to provide reliable information or predict climate changes, if you will, and also to be able to provide climate information, to various users such as farmers, such as those who are involved in disaster risk reduction and so forth. And we are also actually working with the support of the Italians to be able to establish an early warning system for natural disasters, because we feel that's also a gap that we are struggling with. And through the disaster risk reduction program, we have established what is called the Science and Technology Advisory Group to be able to support us in terms of providing scientific information. And there's also collaboration with the Periphery University, which is an organization or a collaboration among the universities aimed at supporting efforts for addressing disasters. And we have also started collaborating with the WMO, or World Meteorological Organization, to support us in the production of the Africa Climate Report, which is supposed to be annual. Maybe in future it could be biannual as well, so that we can be able to educate, our people in terms of the importance of the changing climate and how that relates to their development. But the main challenge that we have is that we are lagging behind when it comes to issues of science, especially documentation. There are a lot of efforts that are happening on the continent in terms of climate initiatives, especially those related to adaptation. But unfortunately, most of those lessons are not systematically documented. So that's actually a gap, and for that reason, we intend to work with other institutions that have got a stronger hand or an upper hand in that area to be able to strengthen our capacity to do so as well. Thank you very much.
You're on mute, I guess.
Sorry, I'm trying to minimize the background noise. I want to just now turn to Madame Montesi and basically ask you, Madam, you've had Dr. Nyambe and some of the sort of challenges that he mentioned within the African Union Commission, especially challenges related to science. And you've also had Professor Gounod about the importance of science and that sort of science policy interface. I know that the EU is doing quite a lot to support partner countries, but also to support countries that are going to be more impacted by climate change. So could you give us a sense of, you know, the scale of the work that the EU is doing in Africa, and also just a sense of, you know, the urgency that we need to ensure that climate change adaptation is in fact effective?
Thank you, Fatima. A lot of questions in the same question, but I'm very happy to join this panel, to join the discussion. And maybe let me start by saying that it's this panel is it's clearly timely because it followed a very good outcome of the Climate Ambition Summit that we had last September, and take place just before the Climate Adaptation Summit next week. Oh, so sorry. So let me maybe just create the link with what the Secretary of State just mentioned about the Green Deal. Sorry, Fatima. Maybe you can give the floor to one other panelist. In the meantime, I come back to you. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. Let me move. Okay, no problem. You take your time. Let me move to Professor Rockstrom. Just basically, Professor Johann, you've also been working in this area, and many of these challenges are not foreign to you. We've had 20 years of climate adaptation, and I hope we're getting cleverer in terms of some of the strategies that Christoph mentioned. Is there a need, do you think, for greater co-creation of knowledge or of research between researchers and policymakers? Should we maybe fast track adaptation activities in Africa?
Yes, thanks, Fatima. And those are really at the frontier of our scientific priorities today. How do we fast track what I would define today as zero carbon adaptation measures, which are de facto integrated resilience building efforts? So we're seeing a trend line here where not only are we, so to say, finding ourselves in a universal agenda where north or south, everyone is impacted and exposed by climate impacts, and that we are seeing one additional argument to the very good arguments or results presented by Christoph of why we need science. I would add to the rationale of why we need science that the pace and scale of change is unprecedented, and we often look at species in ecosystems not being able to adapt to the pace of change. Well, the same goes for humans, that we're seeing shifts in rainy seasons, we're seeing shifts in temperatures and forest fire frequency and all the exposures and impacts of climate change that exceed the adaptive capacity, and that we now need innovation, understand interconnectivity, and particularly, and I think that comes to your point, Fatima, we need to truly not only have interdisciplinary research linking the biophysical assessments of exposure and impact with the social sciences of human vulnerabilities and behaviors, with economics, institutions, in the context of cross-scale interactions. And this is, of course, massively challenging, and that's why I think the co-creation of knowledge is absolutely fundamental. That might sound almost daunting, but I'm actually personally quite optimistic here, because we have two trend lines. One trend line is the almost equally exponential pace of development when it comes to digital methodologies, big data handling, artificial intelligence, and all the kind of integration of information that we can now handle in our analytics. And Christoph gave some good examples of that, of isn't it quite extraordinary how we can now pinpoint at high resolution down to district level in a country like Ethiopia, where you have suitability differences with regards to producing, in this case, maize. So I think it's that's a kind of a positive trend line. The other positive trend line is that we have learned a lot on how to do co-design and co-development of knowledge. I think we in the scientific community are much better placed today to work together with business, with policy, with civil society, and with communities on the ground on innovation and development. And just to give you one example there, we are today quite heavily involved actually in connecting, supercomputer-based global climate modeling with small-scale innovations among rain-fed farmers in countries like in Burkina Faso and Niger, and engaging with the communities to find zero carbon resilience building adaptive solutions. And Christoph presented agroforestry, but as we know, we have so much potential of scalability today on local adaptive water harvesting systems, conservation agriculture, zero tillage practices, ecological sanitation systems. You can really have a whole smorgasbord of options of how to build resilient, in this case, farming systems to handle the challenges of exposure to climate change. So the challenges are really massive, but we're also having pathways of how to move this forward. My absolute last message, only, Fatima, is a point that has been mentioned briefly, which is we know from all the assessments that we're no longer in an incremental change journey. The 10 years in front of us, so this decisive decade from 2021 now to 2030, is the decade of transformation. It's the decade where we are at a point where we need to cut the global emissions by half, we need to halt loss of biodiversity, and we need to fundamentally build resilient livelihoods to deliver on the sustainable development goals. And it's not linear. None of these are linear. And I think that's another argument why we need co-development of knowledge together to be able to embark on these positive non-linear trends. Back to you, Fatima.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Johann. Could we, I'm not sure whether Madame Montesi is back on, but...
Yes.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, many thanks. I'm very, very sorry for what is happened.
No
so,
problem.
Fatima, you were asking about our role and the research, just in the link with what Christoph and Dr. Nyambe said. And so let me maybe start also from what the Secretary of State already mentioned about our engagement as European Union to take really seriously our challenges on climate change, and how the Secretary of State was mentioning, in fact, the European Union has launched what we have called the European Green Deal, so the European growth strategy, with clearly the objective of to have Europe become climate neutral and climate resilient by 2015. This is clearly what wants to be a transformative agenda that will combine all the policies to tackle climate change and to reverse the biodiversity lost, while creating a decent job and leaving no one behind. I mentioned this because it is for us, it's clearly the comprehensive response to a more sustainable development, because we know very well that we are not on track to achieve SDG nor the Paris Agreement. And we know very well that, as was already mentioned by the Secretary of State, that this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, is clearly one other wake-up call that demonstrate how urgent it is for us to respect and protect our planet better. As was just mentioned by my previous speaker, clearly we have a big challenge now and in the next month where we will test our collective ability to deliver on the sustainable recovery aligned with the 1.5C objective set in the Paris Agreement. So we clearly have to take this engagement, this opportunity to reform very, very seriously. And we want to do this in strong partnership with our other countries and other stakeholders, be private or the public. So we are clearly engaged to build back greener and better at international, in Europe, but also international level. Linking this with the key elements on research, just allowing me to do that in this big package of the Green Deal policy, we have also a strong engagement to work much more on everything that is research. Allow me just to mention that we will launch very soon in our future financial perspective, future financial budget, for example, the Horizon Europe 2021-2027, where we launch a big program on research and innovation. And we want to do exactly the same also with our partners in Africa. Dr. Nyambe already mentioned one of the big programs that we have, but we will continue to do this using all the instruments that we have, because of course this will be working on research and analyzing data. It will be the only means that will allow also us to act better on the adaptation and our global challenges on climate. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Madam Montesi. Dr. Savadogo, it's quite clear that you need a whole arsenal of different interventions. You need knowledge, you need partnerships, and you need some of the financial instruments as well. Johann talked about this being the decade of transformation. Do you see that transformation in sight? Are we getting closer to a period where African policymakers are commissioning research? Is there that sort of connection between the research and the policy? Is that coming through from where you sit?
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you for inviting us. We are happy to be part of this panel. And of course, the question you are putting forward is really extremely important. Of course, we can see some signs of our progress when it comes to science, policy interactions, and how science can feed policy with relevant, excellent, and timely information to guide their decisions. So, but I want to emphasize on maybe a few aspects that nevertheless we need to continue to strengthen. The first aspect of it is we need, as rightly mentioned, reliable data. And when you talk about reliable data and timely information, it means also we need capacity to do that. And investing in those capacity are very important to accelerate what we all are wishing to see as big transformation happening in the region. And in this regard, I will see some good examples. For example, Wascal itself is an example of that. We are thankful for the financial support from the German government through the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and of course the Ministry in charge of Education Cooperation, whereby we see we are able to build capacity of young scientists that can really help raise our scientific profile in the region. And this is very key, because sometimes we just overlook this aspect, assuming that we have enough capacity, but that's not the case. We need really to build that capacity of our young scientists, and building that capacity is important. And then also building infrastructure and facilities that can help in the region. First, have enough observation networks that will allow us to have data that can allow for context-specific projections, and that will allow for clear possible pathways that we can inform policies. And this is something that is very important. Then, of course, partnership between scientists is, for us, the north-south and south-south cooperation is key in this process. And the project we are having with Agrica is a good example. And I would like to encourage in the EU cooperation that we build on such examples and try to scale it up, and then make sure that with those capacities we continue to build, and with that strong scientific cooperation we are having, we can really structure our contribution, scientific contribution, to guide policies for effective implementation and strategies. So this is very important, and from my point of view, we need to work really hard on this particular aspect, because we all know that without reliable science, reliable guidance from the scientific part, we cannot achieve our transformational target we are putting forward. Back to you.
Thank you very much, thank you very much, Dr. Savadogo, for those points, and appreciated the point you made also about ensuring that there is sufficient capacity built, and also bringing on board young scientists as well in the process. There's a general question that I wanted to ask, and this is also a question that is linked to some of the unique challenges that we face in Africa. This is a region, and I'm sure Christoph would have noted that, but this is a region that suffers from structural underfunding of research. Research goods, Dr. Savadogo, are not often valorized. They're not often valued. Some of the findings, very interesting findings that Christoph talked about, are findings that would have to be made accessible. I want to understand better, in terms of that meeting place of science and policy, who does that? How do we make the research, how do we translate it into goods that would be attractive enough for policymakers to say, let's ramp up adaptation? What do we need to do to make it more sexy, more attractive?
Thank you so much. Can I?
Yes, please.
Yes, this is, of course, important. Look at the way, for example, globally, we have been able to raise awareness about climate change, and able to have all the parties getting together to sign the UNCCC, and then the Paris Agreement and others. How this has been done, you are all aware how important science played a role through the IPCC, and how there is a matter of how we structure the process of transforming the scientific information into practical actions. And that process, climate services, is key. It's not enough to just go have projections, good projections, but these ones, as we know, we have in sub-Saharan Africa a complex and diversity of production systems. Just to take example from agriculture, you have a diversity of production systems. So we need a kind of integrated approach in science to make sure that we capture and respond to the policy needs. And to be able to respond, we need platforms where scientists and policymakers and all the other actors can join force, identify together the need, and then respond, assigned to respond to it, and then, of course, document it properly and translate it into scientific decision. We need a very well-structured process. That's where this example of Agrica, the approach that has been used by Agrica, is laudable. And per se, with a co-construction we develop with the policymakers and all other actors. That co-construction is key for us to translate effectively what we know as scientific result into practical actions.
Thank you. Johann?
Yes, so let me complement these really important points by Salvador with taking more of a kind of an academic entry point to this, because what you're putting your finger on here, Fatima, is so fundamental, and it's not only structural, it is therefore also a slow variable. And then we've seen this over decades, how universities across Africa have a challenge to keep pace with the infrastructural development, the methodological development, to keep senior staff and resources in place to really invest in the next generation of young interdisciplinary scholars in the whole area of sustainable development. And I think we have a huge responsibility, and of course BMZ and GIZ and the equivalents across Europe and the whole, let's say, industrialized part of the world have an enormous responsibility that is not only about co-designing, co-development solutions, it's also about investing in building capacity. And I would like to see much more of the kind of old-time projects we had 20 years ago, but much less today, with scholarships for master students, scholarships for PhD students. I remember being part of running the START network that still exists, but is much less funded today on kind of investing in young scholars and global change research. I was heading the WaterNet in the SADC region, so now we're in Eastern and Southern Africa. It still exists, building up a master program for integrated water resource management. I think we need much more of this, that we come in as partners, but actually altruistically give capacity development to young talent across the continent, which is there, but must be given the chance.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm a little bit. Yes, please. Yes, Madam Montesi.
Yes, maybe if I can join, because with what just said about Dr. Salvadogo, it's very, very important. Let me just add that European Union and its member states is today almost the largest provider of public climate finance in the world. We have all taken the engagement to mobilize $100 billion per year in climate finance until 2025, and everything that we do, we represent 150 of all the developed countries' goal. But this said, clearly, I agreed with him that we need to capitalize a lot in science and in capacity building, and also taking into account the specificity of the different regions. Because when we look to Africa, of course, Africa is hard hit by the consequence of the climate change, the environment degradation, the pollution, but the impact on climate change, it's really different from region to region. So it's really important that for each region, each Africa region, we look to what are the impact in the agricultural sector, in the fight against diversification, in the coastal zone management area, and etc. And the science on this will be crucial, as once again the knowledge and the data. And let me say that with our partner countries in Africa, we are working also with a huge program on research in the agricultural sector that is called the DESIRA, where we clearly are looking what are region by region the best practice, the scientific evidence at all level, in order just to keep the measure in a way that are clearly adapted to each region, to each, we say, local, almost also municipality authorities. So from the global, the continental, to the regional, to the local municipalities, in order to be really adequate to this. But as Dr. Savagodo said, it's very, very important to invest in capacity building. And I'm happy to say that also in the future, we want to enlarge our Erasmus program that is very known in Europe, also to our African countries, in order to exchange also not just the collaboration between institute of research, but also between students working also in the research domain. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Montesi, and for that point about the range of actors, especially municipalities and local actors, that we need to bring on board. I want to ask a provocative question, and I want to bring on board Dr. Nyambe in this, and perhaps Christoph as well. We have had several decades of adaptation. We have seen many capacity building programs come and go. Johann has mentioned a few. We have an Africa Adaptation Initiative. The State Secretary mentioned that one. We have an African Renewable Energy Initiative. We had the Clean Earth Initiative. We have so many capacity building programs that are coming on board. Is this a time also to rethink some of our capacity building programs? Because clearly some of the programs are not working in terms of that injection of the findings that they're coming up with, the capacity into policies. Do we need to also think through the different capacity programs, building programs that are on board? Is this now an imperative? Dr. Nyambe?
Thank you, ma'am. Indeed, Africa, with all due respect, we are known for elaborating a lot of frameworks and putting up in place a lot of initiatives. But normally, the issue of sustainability, sometimes it's quite a challenge. But nonetheless, the programs that you mentioned, like, for example, Africa Adaptation Initiative, that one I can tell you that is actually making progress. And so far, it has been receiving support as well. And the commissions that are there also that were established, like the Sahel, the Congo, as well as the Islands Commission on Climate Change, they are also actually making quite good progress. But I think what we need is a flagship programs such as Great Green Wall, which bring all the initiatives together, because you find that it covers issues of desertification, issues of climate change, issues of livelihoods, issues of agriculture. All of them are embodied in such a program. I think if we focus on such programs, we'll be able to make inroads or make more impact than if we go for all these single, multiple initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to bring on board Christoph. Could I also just say that if you're not speaking, whether you could just mute, because I'm getting a lot of interference. It might be from my end, that if I could just mention that you could mute. Christoph, any insights on that question about the multiple of capacity building programs that we're seeing, but somehow we're not actually moving the needle when it comes to that interface of policy and science?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fatima, for this question. And I think this is a very important question. I think we have seen also in the the entire debate today that data are so key. And I think in the end, all these data has to be produced by someone, and this requires capacities. And Dr. Savadogo mentioned also the very important North-South and South-South collaboration. And I think we should focus a bit more on this and have to, come out with new development and capacity programs which consider also the new challenges we face right now with regard to climate change, with regard to loss of biodiversity. And I think we have to count this in. And on the one side, and on the other side, we also have to consider that a lot of knowledge goes after spending time at the university or scientific institutes, goes to the industry, goes to this policy and so on. And I think we also have to include the alumni of these the people they worked in science before and now at other places in the capacity building programs, to make sure that they have the knowledge from all sides, from private sector, from academia, from policy, civil society on board. And I think this is quite important. And I guess there are good programs already also mentioned by Ms. Montesi from the EU. The Erasmus program supports this a lot, but also from the German government, the DAAD, for instance, supporting this a lot, exchanging with researchers around the globe, and also mainly focusing now on sub-Saharan Africa. I think these are good efforts, and I think we should continue there and make this stronger, these collaborations.
Thank you. Just a reminder, I mean, I'm not sure whether I jinxed the conversation earlier by saying we want an interactive and very, very animated conversations. There are no questions so far, but please, we're all part of this same dialogue, and it would be great if you could raise, if you could ask questions to our panelists, so that at least we're not just talking to ourselves. But I wanted to turn back to Johann, and he talked about optimism. And I wanted to ask you, Johann, whether in terms of that optimism that you mentioned, do you get a sense that we are postponing adaptation action? Are we still in that sort of old days of adaptation versus mitigation? Do you have a sense, Johann, that there are some hard choices that we need to make moving forward?
Yeah, I should perhaps qualify that answer by saying that I think the policy debate, unfortunately, still remains, quite conventionally stuck in the adaptation versus mitigation agenda. That we still have quite a fragmented policy debate when it comes to funding in the public domain, and I think that is quite unfortunate, because when you look at actions on the ground, and also the science ground, and also the science moving beyond adaptation and separating adaptation and mitigation. I'm sitting on the mission, one of the mission boards of the European Commission today, guiding Horizon Europe, which is the next 10 years of research funding across the European Union, which after all happens to be the largest economic zone in the world. And there we are redefining adaptation actually as a zero carbon adaptation, and that the focus is on climate resilience. It's really about integrating land, water, biodiversity, livelihoods, health, to build resilient zero carbon livelihoods. Why? For the simple reason that we've run out of time. There is no time to focus separately on adaptation and then do some mitigation on another agenda. And it's also a big accelerator in the sense that if we want to take, for example, food security seriously in across the entire semi-arid, particularly semi-arid zone in Africa, then we need to build resilient farming systems able to deal with the unavoidable shocks and stresses we're seeing due to climate change. So that is kind of more classic adaptation. But we also need to put in place economic policy measures that compensate farmers for building carbon sinks and thereby become mitigation agents and landscape stewards. I think it's time for us to start like truly integrating these agendas for action. I mean, to take us, as Christoph suggested, from the diagnostics all the way to the action space. This is demanding. I mean, there's no doubt that there is today. I would postulate that there's a mismatch today between where the conventional policy and politics is, and where the science and development is today kind of focusing in. And I think we have a task here to try and integrate these into the same agenda. Let me close by saying also that one reason for optimism is that many of the solutions when it comes to, let's say, zero carbon resilience building in poverty-stricken communities in the developing world are ready to scale. I mean, what we're lacking is not so much knowledge gaps, it's really finding the mechanisms for scaling. How do you get access to microcredits so that you can really start investing in linings for water harvesting systems across large regions, rather than the kind of islands of pilot schemes we're seeing still today. So it's finding mechanisms for large scale implementation, which I think is parts of our big challenge today.
Yes, Fatima, Fatima, you are muted.
Yes, I was just going to ask you a question based on what Johann mentioned about the necessity to find mechanism for large-scale implementation. You talked about the EU Green Deal, and you also talked about the EU being one of the biggest funders, especially in terms of climate action. I was wondering, what is the emphasis that you place on adaptation, especially in the EU Green Deal?
Yeah, thank you, Fatima. Allow me just to briefly maybe support what Johann just said. You were mentioned that you want a dynamic discussion, but I really would like to support what Johann said about the division between adaptation and mitigation, and clearly underline what you just said, that when we focus, we are focusing on preparing our research program, our Horizon Europe program, our research innovation program. Clearly, we are focusing in a really vast area on adaptation to climate change, but including also the societal transformation that we have. So we can have a really research innovation that we focus on climate science, but we focus also on climate resilience, on adaptation, on knowledge directly for climate neutrality, and also going in a really specific domain, because we were talking about agriculture, but we know that just to be able to have an agriculture that is climate compliant, we will have to work more and more into the agroecology. And just looking to the agroecology, we have a lot of work that we need to be done at the research level. So it will be very, very important, our future work into this research domain. Now, on your question on the future investment on adaptation and climate change, allow me to say that, of course, also in our future cooperation, this element will be really very, very important. We have just added the new financial instrument that was adopted in December, so it's just newly adopted. It's the new financial instrument that will guide us in our partnership with the partners in the next 7 years. And allow me to say that the co-legislator were quite ambitious, because we established there that 30% of the budget will have to be used climate-related subject. So we'll have a clearly spending target that will be related to our climate objective. And of course, this will imply to use for adaptation, for mitigation. And yes, and also in any case will be support all the action that will be clearly relevant for in order to respect the Paris Agreement. Sorry, Fatima, you were interrupted. Okay, go over to you.
No, apologies. We're going to come to the end of our conversation very soon. But there are some questions that have come from the audience, our participants. One of those questions is on the climate risk management, the fact that this includes various interventions, including early warning emergency preparedness, as well as response and long-term risk management at local and national level. So I guess the person asking this question perhaps might want to hear a little bit about that. Another question, and maybe Christoph could perhaps take that question. Another question is about the lack of common narratives for agreed set of risk management actions across and within sectors, including agricultural and food systems. So there is a sense that the narratives are not aligned. I wonder whether perhaps Madame Montesi and Dr. Nyambe could maybe elaborate on that in terms of how do we align these narratives and ensure that they are speaking to these sectors that are climate sensitive. We also have one last question that is talking about what can we in Germany learn from our partners in Africa. So perhaps Dr. Savadogo, you could elaborate a little bit on that in terms of connections and alignment of biodiversity protection and climate action. In other words, the questioner wants to understand what adolescents, we were talking about co-learning and co-production. So what action in the field could Germany support? So we have roughly around 6 minutes, but if we could maybe very briefly, respond to this question. A quick word on the risk management in terms of the different interventions. Any takers?
Maybe I can start. And yeah,
yes,
thanks.
Please.
Thank you very much for this question. I think these are quite good questions which we should address also. And I take the first question on the risk assessment. I think definitively you made a very good point that early warning systems are so important, and it's what we face already with climate change is that extremes are increasing substantially, and therefore we need other systems at place, also giving advice on when a disaster will happen and also what to do then, that a cascade of action is taken after a disaster strikes. And I think they are definitively including the African risk capacity, for instance, or other institutions or other early warning systems is quite important also, which we see more important with climate change, and also trying to support this at PIK at this stage. As the first point. And the second point, very briefly, I think the question on the common narratives, I think this is also quite important point with respect to, in the end, we should also compare the results of, for instance, biodiversity loss and agricultural impacts and water impacts on health or disasters. So this is always difficult to compare these results, and because of this, we also need some standardization in the process, in the assessment, to get to clearer pictures, also to compare between sectors and also to compare between countries. And there, I guess, the climate risk profiles are a first step, and I would be happy also to continue there. Stop here. You're muted.
And any quick complementary responses to those questions asked? I think Christoph has done a great job of responding, but there is a question about what can we learn from Africa? Dr. Savadogo?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that there are many things we can learn from Africa. The first one I would like to tap on is, for instance, we talked about the capacity building aspect. And if you look at in Africa, what we need is to make sure that we get very well qualified young scientists to be on board. The second aspect is, how do we help to develop business models? These business models that can also enable the private sector to be well taken on board. And this needs to be co-developed. A joint scientists, policymakers, private sector, and end users coming together to co-develop pilots based, of course, on the scientific information, implement it, build a business model around it that can make it really sustainable and can be taken up by private sector that can also invest in it. So this is a process that we are currently in, and I think that this needs to be more supported. And with our AU partners, we are eager to see how we can upscale such approach, whereby we can really move faster. This is done in agricultural sector. This is done also in renewable energy sector. And I do think that investing more in the renewable energy sector will help really speed up some of the transformation in agri sector and all other sectors, because I'm seeing there a great opportunity where EU and AU partnership can be very strongly built in. So from my point of view, we can also build on the best practices we have rightly on the ground. We see on the ground some very good practice, evaluative climate smart agriculture practices that can be supported further and then upscale to more wider usage and development across the region. And I think those are areas where we can strengthen our collaboration, our partnership, and investment. And then lastly, in terms of, as I said, climate and environmental services, we can really provide to the different stakeholders to help them take the right actions. Back to you.
Excellent. I think that's a really very comprehensive response, Dr. Savadogo. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of this conversation. There are so many questions that could be asked, but I think that would be the subject of a further discussion. State Secretary Yeager, in his introductory remarks, talked about the importance of evidence-based research, talked about the importance of anticipatory action. And for me, adaptation is exactly that. It's about how we anticipate better, how we anticipate risk, and how we plan better. I think we have given sufficient information to our participants about the varied risks that we face, but also there's many different opportunities, especially the ones that Christoph made very evident in his presentation. We've talked also about knowledge. Knowledge and partnership, I think, are the greatest alibi that we have. I know that Professor Johann has talked a lot about science being this frontier and the planetary boundaries. And in that, I would say knowledge and partnerships are very important if we're to make changes in terms of how we manage adaptation. So one of the points I would like to end with is to say, how do we as scientists come up with very simple one-liners that climate information services equal poverty reduction. I think we need to really front load our communications and begin to transfer and to deploy knowledge in a way that policymakers would really understand these headlines. That this is ultimately about poverty reduction. It's ultimately about development. And I think that, going back on that note of optimism that Johann mentioned, and that was also very evident in State Secretary Jaeger's introductory remark, I am hopeful that with all the changes we're seeing in terms of digital transformation, in terms of partnership, in terms of capacity building, that we are on the pathway to managing climate change risk and impacts, and doing that where it matters, especially in Africa. So with that, I would like to thank you all. Thank Secretary Jaeger for staying through. In my neck of the woods, we're not used to having politicians and policymakers stay through all in the course of a conversation of this length. So thank you very much, State Secretary, for staying through. Thank you also to all our participants who have been able to stay with us and then ask some very important questions. I would like to thank also all our panelists, Johann Rockstrom, Christoph Gonot, Dr. Sabadogo, Madam Carla Montesi, and also Dr. Nyambe for your very insightful comments. And to also thank BMZ and as the organizers who really facilitated and enabled this meeting. So thank you all. It's not exactly German precision on time, but it's 15:33 on my watch. So thank you very much for this, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye
Thank
bye
you.
to you all.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.